This video shares stories about the incidents and experiences of drug addicts for awareness purposes only. It is not intended to glorify, encourage, or promote drug use in any way. The goal is to highlight the harsh realities and consequences associated with substance abuse. It's hard for me to sit down and tell this story. I really hope that by hearing it, someone will be able to stop themselves from falling into the same abyss in which I lost myself. If I decided to share this, it was not to attract attention, but to warn those who believe that drugs are only a temporary escape, a harmless diversion, or a way to disconnect from reality. If you are on that path or are even considering it, I want you to know that a nightmare awaits you from which there may be no turning back. I know this because just 3 months ago, I managed to get out of rehab. Today, I still feel the weight of that night, and every day I wonder if I will ever be able to truly forgive myself. But what hurts the most is knowing that while I try to rebuild my life, there is someone who will not have that opportunity. Someone who is no longer here because I could not help him. It was a hot summer night. It all started as one of the many nights I spent with Lucas, my best friend. We both had crossed the line of recreational drug use a long time ago. It was easy to get lost in that world. We lived in a small American town without much to offer, and sometimes it seemed that drugs were the only way to escape the monotony of our lives. Lucas and I had shared many nights in which reality was blurred between smoke and hallucinations, looking for a liberation that never lasted. On those nights, the limits seemed to blur, and no matter how much we lost control, we always ended up believing that we could return to normal the next day. Lucas had been my friend since adolescence. We understood each other, and he was one of those few people with whom I could be myself without pretending. Life had united us in some strange way, and although we knew that our friendship was marked by self-destruction, neither of us considered changing. But that night was different, a night that would remain engraved in my mind forever. We had decided to meet in my apartment, a small and dark space in which there was barely room for a sofa, a table, and a mattress on the floor. We met there because we did not want anyone to bother us, because that night would be just for us, to forget everything else. That night, Lucas arrived with some acid, and I had gotten some cocaine. Also, as we almost always had, a bottle of cheap vodka to accompany. We sat on the floor, and as the first hours passed, we began to mix more and more substances, playing to push our own limits, laughing like nothing could touch us. It was that false security, that feeling that we were invulnerable, and that the inner world didn't matter. We started with a few lines of cocaine, talking about meaningless topics, about absurd dreams of the people who music as if I were a stranger, someone he had to defend himself from. His hands were shaking, and his breathing became more agitated. I tried to talk to him, tell him that everything was okay, but he didn't answer. He just got up and started walking from one side of the room to the other, muttering things that I couldn't understand. It was at that moment that I realized that something was very wrong. Time seemed to stop. The whole atmosphere of fun and camaraderie fell apart in seconds. Lucas began to say things that didn't make any sense. He said that someone was outside, that they were watching us. His eyes moved quickly from one side to the other, staring at the door, at the window, as if he was about to burst into panic. I tried to calm him down, tell him that it was just a bad trip and that no one was there, but every word seemed to make things worse. "They are going to kill us, Hernan," murmured as if he were speaking to himself. His words came out with difficulty, full of terror. "They killed them all. There is no one left. I am alone." Seeing him in that state provoked a mixture of fear and frustration. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. I tried to tell him that he wasn't alone, that I was there with him, but he didn't seem to listen to me. His words became more and more teethed, and then he began to talk about his family. He told me that they had killed everyone, his mother, his father, that there was no one left in this world. I repeated to him that it was just a hallucination, but he was completely lost in his own mind. Despite his state, he still maintained some kind of connection with me. With each passing second, his paranoia became more intense. His skin began to sweat, his eyes filled with tears, and suddenly he began to tremble. It was then that he looked at me with a mixture of desperation and rage and said, "Hernan, I'm hungry. I'm very hungry." At first, I thought it was just a meaningless phrase, another part of his delirium. I told him that if he wanted, we could look for something to eat, trying to distract him a little. I got up, but when I came back, I looked at him, and I saw him with a glass bottle in his hand. In an instant, he broke it against the wall. The shards of glass fell to the floor, but he took one of them, a long, sharp piece. He raised it to his face and stared at it as if it were something precious. I wanted to react, I wanted to take it from him, but he was paralyzed. I couldn't understand what he was doing. The next thing I saw was how he brought that piece of glass to his mouth and began to chew it. The sound of the glass breaking between his teeth was one of the most terrifying noises I have ever heard in my life. A dry and brittle sound that still haunts me in my nightmares. I saw the blood that began to flow from his lips, staining his face and falling to the floor in small drops. I tried to stop him. I tried to snatch the glass from him, but Lucas pushed me with a strength that I didn't think he had. He screamed that he had to do it, that he had to calm his hunger. It was a need that he didn't understand, but that consumed him. He was trapped in that madness, and I didn't know how to save him. With each bite, his mouth filled with blood. His lips and gums were tearing, but he kept chewing, oblivious to the pain, ignoring the suffering. It was as if he was on another plane, as if reality no longer existed for him. In the midst of his delirium, he found an old razor that he had left in the bathroom. Before he could do anything, he took it and began to chew the blades with the same desperation. I tried to take it from him, but it was useless. The blood flowed with more intensity, and soon the floor was filled with red stains while small particles of glass and metal mixed with the thick liquid that covered his hands and his face. It was not only a violent scene, it was the very representation of self-destruction. I looked at him without being able to understand what was happening. I tried to stay awake, maintain my own lucidity, but the horror of seeing my friend devour himself was more than I could bear. His body trembled, his eyes faded, and at some point, his strength began to abandon him. He fell to his knees with his bloody face, and then everything seemed to stop. It was at that moment when I understood that something horrible was about to happen, something that I could never erase from my memory. I felt a mixture of fear, helplessness, and guilt. How had we gotten there? How did I allow that, Luke? I got to that point. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think. I could only watch as her life faded away in front of me. I woke up in a hospital bed with a pain in my chest and a weight on my conscience that I had never felt before. Everything was confusing, and it took me a moment to understand where I was. The first thing I saw were the faces of my parents, full of worry and sadness. My mother hugged me, but her crying was uncontrollable. I felt the weight of her tears, and although I didn't understand what was happening, I knew that something very serious had happened. Then I saw the police. There were several agents in the room, and their looks were loaded with suspicion and mistrust. When I saw the police, a chill ran through my body. I had barely regained consciousness, and I was already surrounded by questions that I couldn't understand. My mother's face was bathed in tears, and my father, always so reserved, had an expression that I had never seen before. He seemed defeated. The officers approached the bed and began to ask me questions, but their words sounded far away, as if I were trapped underwater. My mind tried to capture something, anything, but my head only managed to repeat the blurry chaos of the night before. The questions became more and more insistent. They wanted to know what had happened in my apartment. They wanted to know if I remembered anything of the scene in which they found me. Apparently, when the paramedics arrived, the room was covered in blood, and Lucas, my best friend, was dead next to me. They told me with a coldness that made me shudder. I closed my eyes, trying to assimilate those words, trying to remember something, anything, but my mind resisted. One of the officers leaned over and with a firm but low voice began to speak directly into my ear, as if he wanted to make sure I understood every word. "Hernan, what we found there was not just an accident. We have to know what happened. Your friend died in a horrible way, and the evidence makes us think that someone could have intervened. We need to know if you have something to tell us, The word intervene shook me. They were insinuating that I could have had something to do with Lucas's death, and that made me feel colder than the steel of the handcuffs that seemed to insinuate themselves in the depths of their words. Couldn't be true. Lucas and I had spent time together so many nights. We had shared so many laughs. How could they think I would do something like that? My hands were shaking, and my mind refused to remember. But every time I tried to hold on to some fragment of the night before, I could only see blood. Blood on his lips, on his hands, and the sound of glass crushing in his mouth, like an echo that refused to go away. Days went by, and my life seemed to have stopped. The police interrogated me over and over again, trying to get some confession that even I didn't understand. I tried to explain to them what I remembered, how Lucas had lost his mind, how his paranoia had consumed him, how he had convinced himself that someone had murdered his family, and that he was the last one standing. I told them about how he clung to his delusion of how he began to bite the glass and the knives, but every word he said seemed to increase his distrust. "And why didn't you call 911? Asked one of the detectives, looking at me with an expression of deep doubt. Why didn't you stop him before he got to that point? I had no answer for that. All I could do was look at them with eyes full of tears, feeling trapped in a labyrinth of guilt that he couldn't escape. I knew I should have stopped him, that I'd seen the signs, I'd felt the terror in his words, but so had I. I was lost in my own confusion, on my own drug-distorted trip. My mind was so clouded that night, I didn't even think about reaching out for help. The days went by, and the situation only got worse. Lucas's family was torn apart, and apparently to them I was the one to blame. My parents tried to support me, but they were broken. I could barely look them in the eyes. I knew deep down they were wondering if I'd really been able to do anything to Lucas. That doubt was there, hanging in the air, in every broken conversation, in every silent whisper. Finally, after weeks of questioning, investigators determined that Lucas's death had been a suicide induced by paranoia and the bad trip. The autopsy revealed that he had ingested pieces of glass and razor blades until he pierced his stomach and intestines, which had caused internal bleeding. No one could understand how he had reached that point of despair, how his mind had reached such a level of darkness. Despite the fact that the music, all of it had contributed to his death, that burden was mine, and I knew I could never shake it. My parents, desperate and fearful that I would follow the same path, made the decision to check me into rehab. I was there for months, facing the demons that had consumed me. Each therapy session forced me to relive that night, to face the guilt, the fear, and the devastation it had left on my life. 3 months ago, I left rehab. I have been sober ever since, trying to piece together what's left of my life. Although not a day goes by that I don't remember Lucas's face and the terror I saw in his eyes that night. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the creaking of glass and smell the metallic smell of blood. I have tried to forgive myself, but it is a slow and painful process. I know that I will never be able to repair the damage I did, but I can prevent someone else from going through the same. Then this story will have served a purpose. That's why I share it. Not to relive the pain, but to warn those who believe that drugs are only a game, a way to escape from reality. Drugs take you to dark places. They plunge you into a void that you may never be able to get out of. If you're tempted to follow that path, if you ever think that you can control the chaos, remember this story because I thought I could control it, and that night I learned the hard way that it's not like that. I survived, but Lucas didn't, and no matter how hard I want to, I'll never be able to change that. Maybe one day I'll be able to forgive myself, but until then, I'll live with the weight of that night on my shoulders. If you're thinking about using, if you're ever tempted, remember this story because the reality is that sometimes a trip can be your last one. I had a whole Sunday with nothing to do, so I decided to finish what I had left of my Amanita muscaria capsules. This would be my 5th time taking Amanita, and I thought I was prepared, but I was sorely mistaken. I had purchased quality dried capsules from Washington State from a reputable online seller a few months earlier. My first 2 experiences went like this: 2 medium capsules for a good high lasting about 6 hours, and 4 medium capsules for a stronger high lasting 10 hours. They were quite pleasant, except for the occasional muscle spasm at a higher dose. So, I decided to try Ivan's quality Amanita capsules from the same seller. The Ivan capsules were not as potent as the Washington ones, and I was quite disappointed. 2 medium capsules did nothing for me, and 4 medium capsules gave me a high for about 2 hours. I decided I would finish the Ivan and Washington capsules at the same time. 4 small medium capsules from Ivan and 4 small medium from Washington. I was expecting a similar high as I had had before with the 4 medium capsules from Washington. I would estimate this was about a half ounce total, maybe 20 grams max. It should be noted that in all of the experiences, I ate similar foods in similar amounts, a light lunch of mostly grains like pasta and bread about 30 minutes before taking the capsules. I did not experience any nausea, as some others report. The capsules started to take effect within 1 to 2 hours of taking them, as usual. First, I felt as if my body was getting lighter, then my vision started to be affected, and I had a hard time focusing on details. The effects increased as before for about 4 hours. At this point, my vision was flickering in and out, as if someone was turning a light on and off every second. I had experienced this before with high doses of the Washington capsules, but this time it was a little more intense. I had a hard time focusing on the TV, so I decided I would take a nap until my vision returned. There wasn't much else I could do at that point. As I got up to go to bed, the effect intensified much more. Instead of a flashing light every second, it had turned into a very rapid flash. I could barely see where I was walking. Then the effect changed. Now I was seeing a still image smaller than it should be, as if I was looking through binoculars upside down, and it was rapidly approaching me. This was repeating over and over again with the same image because I kept staring into space, and it was increasing in speed with each repetition. Then I felt it repeat the same movement over and over again, as if time was starting to repeat itself instead of just the image getting closer. At that moment, I felt as if I had completely lost my sanity. I came to the sudden realization that I was in hell. Hell was the realization that my entire life up until that point was just a false memory, and that I would continue to experience that moment forever and it would always be new. Nothing I thought I had done in my life mattered, and it made no difference to the decisions I had made because, in the end, at some arbitrary anticlimactic moment, I would realize I was in hell, and I would be repeating my life from the beginning without this knowledge I had just acquired. I screamed out, "My God! I'm in hell! I'm an atheist, so I don't believe in God, hell, or eternity." The horror faded briefly, but it was quickly replaced by something that to me was even more believable and more terrifying. The next part is very hard to describe without a diagram, but I will do my best. I felt my consciousness floating outside of me, and as I looked down, I could see what I interpreted to be the universe was a vertical loop, like a roller coaster track, and I was on top of it. Watching it all, it was segmented into parts with the biggest at the bottom, and they got progressively smaller as I went up to the top, then bigger on the other side until I got to the bottom again. The lowest point was my birth, and the largest segment was my life as I thought I had experienced it thus far. Each segment was my life again, starting at my birth and ending at the moment I realized I was in hell. The size of each segment corresponded to the speed at which I was living, so as I went through the loop, my life sped up each time I experienced it until I got to the top. Then it started to slow down again. In each lifetime, I had already repeated my life several times, and now I was at the top where I could observe the entire universe. No, it was more than that. My consciousness in this infinite loop, I was the only thing that truly existed, and I was doomed to live an imaginary, meaningless life over and over again for all eternity, experiencing a moment of true loneliness and absolute terror and then returning to ignorance to repeat the cycle. I began to scream uncontrollably. This goes on like this forever. It never ends. It goes on forever. This was worse than any nightmare I've ever had. I have no idea how long I continued to scream, but my throat was sore the next day. As if that wasn't enough, for some reason, I thought I could control what was happening. At that moment, as it repeated itself, I felt like I could make things more enjoyable for myself if I chose to repeat a happy moment over and over again instead of realizing I was doomed for eternity. So, I tried to imagine that I was doing something fun. It didn't work. It wasn't enough to imagine it. I had to do it in reality. As I now believed that nothing mattered and the outcome would always be the same no matter what I did, I was not afraid of death. I was already somehow dead. I didn't care either being away from others because they were just fragments of my imagination, nor did I care about the consequences. There was no such thing as the police or jail, so I tried to get out and change things. It took me a while to get the door to my apartment open, but I finally did. Not before I got so frustrated that I threw a bookshelf across the room. However, I felt like I was in a dream. Now, the only moment was no longer repeating itself, but I still had no control over reality. I ran out, went down the stairs, and got to the street. Luckily, the speed limit in my complex is only 5 miles per hour, and there are plenty of speed bumps, so I was in no danger of being hit and killed. Cars were passing by me, and at least one honked. I was yelling at the drivers, "Never mind. No matter what." I clearly remember looking a woman straight in the eyes as she slowed down to pass me. I yelled at her, and she had a look of fear and confusion on her face that I will never forget. I kept running, and for a second I thought I might fly. I jumped into the air and fell back down. I decided that was because I had not yet mastered the skill of altering the laws of physics, but that eventually I might do it. I was wandering around for quite a while, lost in the maze of apartment buildings and parking lots. At some point, I walked across a pond. That came up to me on the treadmill. I was talking out loud to myself, staggering, and immediately called a friend. "I'm in hell," I said. "Where are you?" "At home. In hell." "What did you take and how much?" "I don't know, all that was left. I'm heading over there. I'll be there in a few minutes." From that point on, it was okay. Talking to someone I knew was enough to bring me back to reality. I calmed down and slowly got back to normal over the course of about 4 hours or so. The core effects lasted about 12 hours, but I still feel like curling up in the fetal position when I remember the sound of my own screams, remembering all of this. I'm surprised the police never showed up. I was very lucky not to be arrested, seriously injured, or worse. I'm also very grateful that I didn't hurt anyone because I could never live with myself if I did. I'm not sure if I'll ever take it by hand again, but at least if I do, it will be in smaller doses and never without a companion, just in case. Now I know how dangerous it can be. I wanted a trip, a journey, a flight, whatever you want to call it. I'm a 21-year-old college student for whom acid and shrooms are a thing of the past. When I heard about DMTT, I researched and read, then researched some more, as I always do to make sure. I found a site that sold the ingredients I needed and chose Syrian rue and Mimosa hostilis, as they seemed the easiest to make. The first time I tried this, I couldn't stand it and threw up everything before it could settle, which was awful because it left me feeling sick for the rest of the night. The third time was the charm, as I added some gelatin, which removes fats that irritate my stomach. I boiled 2g of Syrian rue for about an hour in water with some vinegar and ended up with a urine yellow tea, which was easy to swallow. I waited about 20 minutes until I started to feel the effect. The light was sensitive to the eyes, and there was a very slight movement when I concentrated on a particular object. Then I started drinking the tea of Mimosa hostilis with about 2g of Syrian rue, alternating with peach juice. This was the hardest thing I have ever had to swallow in my life. It tasted horrible. After taking it all in, about 15 minutes later, the nausea started again. I ran to the bathroom a couple of times but managed to hold it in. I lit a pipe and smoked some marijuana to help calm the discomfort. Then I put on a movie and waited. At 9:07, it hit me suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. The floor started moving under my coffee table. I looked at my girlfriend, and her face had translucent patterns and tribal marks twisting and rotating on her face. Her irises changed color and spun in the opposite direction of the patterns on her face. Her hair stood up in the air and grew tall before my eyes. She was no longer my girlfriend, but a spiritual shaman, bringing me into this world. The walls were breathing around me, and I was finding it hard to focus on anything. I got up and went to my computer and tried to search for a song on my mind, but the titles and artists changed size and appeared and disappeared from the screen. I found it impossible to concentrate or remember what I was doing. I went back to the kitchen and tried to talk to my partner at 10:15. My girlfriend, who was sober, walked out on me. I guess by this time I didn't make any sense of what she was saying, and I told her I couldn't look at her anymore because the shaman kept coming back and showing himself to me. I started to feel really cold, shivering like I was outside in the snow for hours. At 10:30, my partner was no longer high and fell asleep really quickly, just like when I started having the trip, like another switch had been flipped. I didn't feel good at all anymore. I just felt horrible, seeing nothing but that horrible cold feeling coming from deep within my soul. I made a trip to the bathroom and threw up some bile and then gagged for a few minutes. One of the clumps of saliva took the shape of a lizard that swam through the toilet water and then disintegrated into 1,000 particles. I remember having to make an effort to move and get out of there, otherwise I would have been stuck in the bathroom forever. I laid down on the bed and tried to calm down by closing my eyes. The next thing I remember is that I couldn't fall asleep because if I did, I felt like I would never wake up. A Tim Burton-style clay creature with 10 long black and white striped hind legs entered my mind and laughed at me. It was a disgusting, evil creature with green light coming out of every hole in its head. It had bruises and sores all over its body and moved like the girl from The Exorcist, unnaturally and disjointed, walking down a staircase. At that moment, I knew I wanted to be normal. I was asking myself if I would ever be normal again. The creature crawled, showing my family and how I was going to be a schizophrenic zombie, a waste to society, a waste of the meaning and value of life. I looked at the clock, and it read 10:47. Only a few minutes had passed, and I knew I had many hours ahead of me. I began to try to change my way of thinking, staring at the wall in front of me, letting go, and giving myself over to the journey I had so longed for. After gagging and going back to bed, I finally felt normal. I thought I had probably just gone through the second phase of my trip. I decided not to look at the wall anymore, fearing what might come next, and I put the movie on. A few minutes after the movie started, I felt the trip coming back. At that moment, I kept telling myself that I just had to endure it and that time was on my side. I was in complete darkness again, feeling absolutely crazy. I don't know how to explain it. I couldn't see or imagine anything, but the darkness and loneliness enveloped me. I felt the presence of the creature that was stalking me nearby. So, I watched the movie and wondered if I would ever feel the same again. At 12:26, I felt paralyzed. I didn't want to move, nor did it seem like I could. My eyes could no longer distinguish anything. Everything around me was blurry, and when I closed them, the darkness slowly approached. My girlfriend stretched out her leg and touched my body, and suddenly, we were in a jungle together, traveling through the lands, looking for something. It was like watching a movie in my mind as we moved through the vast scene. I followed my partner towards a clearing with a soft fire without flames, just smoke but still lit. If that makes any sense, there were eyes in the trees watching us, and suddenly, a baby was lifted up by the soft smoky fire, and I felt a celebration inside me inside the clearing. I no longer felt the darkness I had mentioned before. Just as the darkness disappeared, Tim Burton's creature reappeared, the jungle disappeared, and the blackness surrounded me, as if reminding me who was in charge and how I was supposed to feel. The horrible dark feeling came back, and feeling sick, I went to the bathroom. I must have been there for a while or passed out because the next thing I remember, I was in bed again, paralyzed, feeling very alone and uncomfortable. I looked at the clock, and it read 2, but I couldn't read it properly. I felt like I was returning the trip at this point. I was getting used to the scrambled mindset, feeling absolutely crazy. My movements were out of control, moving my head in all directions, not consciously deciding where to look. I'm surprised I didn't give myself whiplash. Then my eyes focused on my cat, Luna, a long-haired black cat with some white in it. I reached out to pet her as she lay at the foot of the bed. Her fur was ashen, and ashes floated in the air as I petted her. She looked so old. It scared me a little, and then nausea hit me again. I was so tired of throwing up, and I just wanted this journey to end. At 3:30 in the morning, after throwing up for the last time, I went back to bed and noticed some color changes in the movie that by then had already started again. I looked at the clock, and it read 3:17. I knew I was finally starting to come down, though the dark, lonely feeling continued, though not as intense anymore. I turned off the TV and just stared at the ceiling for a while. It was almost 5 in the morning, and I was sane enough to be able to sleep. I closed my eyes and tried to store all the things I had experienced in my memory to share in the morning. I woke up around 7:15 and was still kind of high but no longer traveling. I was so glad to be back in the world I knew. Conclusion. This has been by far the most intense journey I have ever been on. I didn't feel in control at times and, frankly, felt completely crazy. I think my Mimosa hostilis is not a good creeper, and I will never travel with her again. I have heard that the API Burdu's creeper generally offers a much more pleasant experience. A friend of mine and I recently decided to experiment with fly agaric. We placed an order and both consumed about 10 g each. About an hour and a half later, I started having a very nice, calm trip. It seemed more relaxed than any other I've tried because I could think and speak much more clearly than with LSD, which can sometimes overwhelm me and leave me speechless. But with Amanitas, that didn't happen, and I really enjoyed the trip until I decided to smoke some salvia. I loaded a full pipe into my water bong and took 2 deep hits, holding it in for a while. About 5 seconds later, my mind started racing out of control. The first thing that went through my head was, this is never going to end. I staggered to my dark, quiet room to try and get my mind under control. But as soon as I laid down, my mind got stuck in a thought loop. All I could do was think about the same thing over and over again. My mind got stuck in a loop, and I thought I would be forced to think the same thing over and over again for the rest of my life. This took me into another reality where I had no control over my body or my mind. It was like being trapped in a daydream that basically left me completely catatonic. No one could get to me. This happened around 11:30 at night. My roommate went to bed around 1 in the morning, and when he laid down, I was sitting on the couch with a blank stare on my face, trapped in the deepest recesses of my mind. When my roommate woke up around noon the next day, I was still sitting in the same spot with my eyes wide open and still totally unreachable. The only reason I can recount this is because that's what I was told. I have no recollection from shortly after taking those 2 hits until about 6 p.m. the next day when I started to come around. Around 5 p.m. the next day, I felt terrified again because I was trapped between 2 realities and felt like I was moving through time differently than everyone else. I started to come out of the fog, totally confused and clueless as to what had happened in the last 20 hours of my life. All I remember is thinking that I had discovered something very profound, like a simple truth that would explain everything in life, but I couldn't remember anything else. It was hell. Eventually, I tried to sleep, but I would lay down and 10 minutes would pass, even though I felt like I had been awake for hours. At one point, I walked out of my room and asked my roommates how long I had slept. I thought it was already the next day. They replied it had only been 10 minutes. So, I decided to do what I should have done the night before, but I couldn't, and that was take some Xanax. Usually, 2 pills make me sleepy, but it took me 8 to finally fall asleep. As soon as the Xanax kicked in, I started to feel normal again, but I felt mentally wrecked. I had no idea what had caused this catastrophe. I felt like I was on the verge of insanity. When I came to, I realized my own mortality very quickly. The best explanation I can find, and would appreciate help if anyone knows, is that the salvia was magnified 10 times by the fly agaric. Very high doses of salvinorin can blow people completely out of reality, but for 20 hours and just 2 puffs of salvia, it's the let it be what caused it. Please be careful. No one should go through this. If anyone knows why a bomb went off in my head when combining salvia and muscaria, please reply in a comment down below. This was the most profound and unpleasant experience of my life. I do not recommend anyone to drink 500 milliliters of pure absinthe. It was a very stupid idea, and I really don't remember drinking it. My story actually started when I woke up on a gloomy Saturday morning, covered in cuts and bruises, and with a horrible headache. I had no idea what had happened apart from the first few drinks I had with a good friend who had brought a bottle of absinthe with him from Spain. I called him on the phone, but he didn't answer. I kept calling other people, hoping someone might have some, if not all, at least part of the story. I managed to gather some information, Apparently, I had gone to my local pub with my friend, who was also drinking the absinthe. Apparently, I made a complete fool of myself, shouting and swearing and wanting to fight a very large group of steroid-abusing guys, which is not my thing at all. Make love, not war, is what I always say. Normally, I'm a quiet person who just enjoys a cigarette and some shrooms every now and then. But that thing changed me in a way that now I understand why Vincent Van Gogh cut off his own ear from drinking too much of that demon liquor. I was so out of it, I probably would have done the same thing. Apparently, my mother found me outside the back door with my pants down, banging my head against the door, cursing at everything under the sun. No mother wants to see her 17-year-old son in such a state, trying to make snow angels on wet grass in pouring rain. The next day, some very vague memories of intensely hallucinating started coming back. This was a stronger and longer-lasting experience than any acid I've ever taken before. I completely lost control of my mind and body. I don't think the steroid guys would be happy with me, but oh well, they're just another brick in the wall. I had no idea absinthe was so weird. After just a few drinks, I became perfectly eloquent, clear, and happy. But when the bottle was emptied between the two of us, I turned into a fucking idiot with no logic or self-control. As for my friend, they found him outside the pub on a bench and took him to the hospital. We're both okay now, but I still feel like I've embarrassed myself for no reason. I started the night of my trip with no intention of using any substance that night. My boyfriend and I had gotten hold of some cocaine and were planning on using it all night. We both snorted 3 lines of cocaine an hour before with very little effect. We thought it was a bad break and that put us off. We snorted 2 more lines and were feeling a bit jittery, but no euphoria or other noticeable effects. So we decided to go on a trip. We both took 3 capsules, a total of 450 milligrams, and chewed them for about 30 minutes. The taste was no worse than other capsules, but the aftertaste lasted for a few days. I could swear I could still taste acid a week after this. This was my first experience with ALLAD, and I'd heard it was a lot less intense than ETHLAD, which I'd had no problems with at 300 milligrams. So, I thought that 450 milligrams would be an adequate dose. After 15 minutes, I began to feel some restlessness and extra energy, but without noticeable visions or hallucinations. 30 minutes later, I was definitely feeling a lot of extra energy, and we decided to go for a walk. The colors were brighter, and the yellow and red hues of being indoors were irritating me. Going for a walk at night outside made the irritation go away immediately. By 45 minutes, I was already in a more elevated mood. The world was starting to distort as colors blended into each other in less colorful twists than with ETHLAD and more geometric patterns. Within an hour, I started to feel a severe stomach ache, a mix between wanting to vomit and an urgent need to go to the bathroom. I usually vomit when I take psychedelics, but I've never had such a strong stomach ache without intense nausea. We decided to go back to the apartment so I could use the bathroom. I was seeing a lot of intense colors, and my mind would start to float as I lost some logic. By the hour and 15-minute mark, my stomach ache was already very strong. I can only describe it as the feeling that there was a knife stabbing me from the inside. I felt like my digestive tract was filled with an intense pressure of diarrhea that I couldn't relieve. No matter how much I tried, I felt like there was a knife inside me constantly stabbing me. At the hour-and-a-half mark, I tried to distract myself from the stomach pain, although it was difficult. My mind was starting to truly shut down, and I was having trouble understanding what my boyfriend was telling me. I had a lot of anxiety because my stomach hurt incredibly, and I didn't understand much of what was going on. The visions were still very geometric, but I didn't focus on them for everything else. The visions were much prettier with ETHLAD, where there was a lot more burst of color than geometry. I told my boyfriend I needed something to slow down, and I went out onto the balcony. I smoked some marijuana in my pipe because I thought it might help with my stomach. I sometimes smoke to relieve stomach pains and hoped this would put me in a more familiar state of mind. I felt much calmer by the end of this moment, and it would be the last moment of sanity I would have for the rest of the night. At 2 hours in, I had gradually lost all understanding of the world. I couldn't understand time at all and began to obsess over how long the trip would last, as I couldn't quite comprehend that it would eventually end up. I imagined sanity as a fabric woven with tiny fibers that form threads, which are in turn woven into a fabric. Each tiny fiber is a neuron in your brain that helps you identify the next fiber and therefore interact with the entire plane of fabric around you to understand it. If sanity was a woven fabric during this time, each of the smallest ones that made up the fabric of my sanity unraveled and scattered in all directions, moving away from each other. I couldn't understand how one thing interacted with another, how to function, and I started to panic. At 2 hours and 15 minutes in, I told my boyfriend I really wanted to call 911 right then and that I was having a panic attack and my stomach hurt incredibly. I was terrified at this point. He tried to calm me down and suggested I take a shower, thinking that might help. I got in the shower for maybe 20 seconds before true panic, the terrifying panic set in. I told him to call an ambulance immediately, or I would go out into the hallway of his apartment to ask someone else to call. He told me that I just needed to calm down, or we would both get in trouble. At this point, I didn't know what was real, and that it wasn't because my boyfriend insists that some of the things I described didn't happen. I remember running to my phone to call the ambulance myself, but he took it from me and wouldn't let me call. I begged him to give me my phone back or call. I couldn't understand his words anymore, so I don't know why he didn't. I ran to the apartment door to get help, but he grabbed me, lifted me up, and held me down. I literally thought my boyfriend was trying to kill me at that moment, and I screamed, "This is how I'm going to die." At 2 hours in med after breaking free from my boyfriend, I ran out into the hallway and screamed that I needed help. Of course, some people poked their heads out. It was a long hallway, and that made the trip worse because it seemed like an endless hallway that never ended. My mind started to fixate on the idea of eternity and my lost sense of time completely shut off. And it was at some point in this phase that I convinced myself that I had already died at some earlier point in the trip and that this was hell. I thought that I would be trapped in my hallucinating mind for all eternity. Since in my mind, I was already dead, I resigned myself and began to act completely crazy. My "I need help" turned into running up and down the hallway, begging someone to shoot me, screaming. I went crazy. Please, someone bring me a gun. Over 3 hours. I'm not sure when this part happened because it felt like years had passed until the cops got there. I think I was in the hallway about 20 to 30 minutes before they got there, but I'm not sure. They didn't handcuff me, but I practically fought the cops the way a 140-pound girl can, trying to get away. They held me until the ambulance got there. After the fight, I sat down in a nearby chair and put my hands behind my head. It was a calming moment for me of beautiful colors and everything an anxiety-free trip should be. But alone with intense colors and a powerful imagination. If only the cops hadn't been there, it would have been so nice. Right then, 3 hours and 15 minutes, I was freaking out again in the ambulance, begging them to shoot me. I started to think my eternity would be a series of rooms or episodes from which I could not escape but would be taken from one episode to the next as the demons around me would allow it. The first episode was the hallway, then the room with the cops, then the ambulance. Hallucinating that one of the paramedics had a gun, and I tried to grab it. At 3 hours and 45 minutes, when I got to the hospital, they injected me with Valium, and I immediately felt much better. Yet, I had a hard time understanding people and what was going on, but I could already tell I wasn't trapped in an eternal hell. My reactions were very slow to people's questions. The visuals were still present, and the hospital room was warped, but it was dark, and that was comforting. At 4 hours and 15 minutes, I called it a day. At this point, the visuals were still present, but the confusion and mental chaos had disappeared. It was then that the doctors told me that upon arrival, my heart rate was at 210 beats per minute, and that if I hadn't gone to the hospital, I could easily have had a heart attack. The blood in my internal organs was also incredibly restricted and could have caused organ failure if I hadn't been injected with something to facilitate blood flow and slow the pressure. The diagnosis was official polysubstance abuse, but I'm not sure if I would have had the same reaction without the cocaine and marijuana. After I kept seeing visuals for almost a full 12 hours after the dose, I was worried I might have been stuck with HPPD, as that usually happens after a bad trip. I think I have mild HPPD, as any substance I consume, even alcohol or marijuana, makes the world now a little more colorful than it used to be. It's been 5 months, and I find light very irritating if I'm not under the influence of any substance. In general, I'm just thankful I didn't get arrested. Now, I have a really bad phobia of long hallways and have previously gone into a trance-like state in long hallways where I would temporarily get disoriented and very anxious. Could be TPT, but I'm not sure. It's going to be a long time before I go on psychedelics again, and if I do, I'm going to have Xanax on hand. I know I'm not the only one this has happened to. I can't be. I'm sure at least some of you know what I'm talking about. That moment when it hits and you realize something is wrong. When you realize it's not just a bad trip. What you took has gone bad, like antibiotics or expired Tylenol. For most of my adult life, I did more than just smoke pot with the occasional night where I could find some sort of hallucinogen. LSD was my favorite, although I wasn't averse to taking mushrooms, and it was the easiest thing to get. 3 months ago, I felt the need to have another one of those spiritual, uplifting nights, as I like to call them. So, I called the guy I normally talk to when I need my Vision Quest materials, and he said something strange. Albert, I don't work tomorrow, so I thought I'd make my night a little special. Do you have anything available? Albert's voice came through the phone in an unusually sober tone. Yeah, I got something for you, but what's good? Some people have been telling me there's something weird with this batch. Weird in what sense? They won't say exactly, but they don't seem to like it very much by how they're reacting. I don't know, maybe it's a strong batch and they don't like the intensity, but like I say, it's just a guess. I was silent on the phone for a few minutes, thinking about that. The next day, I didn't work and it had been months since I had anything stronger than good marijuana. Plus, Albert was my only option for getting drugs. You see, when you're young, it's a lot easier to find people who have the drugs you're looking for. But as you get older, everyone assumes you're a cop, and no one sells you anything. Albert cleared his throat on the other end of the line, snapping me out of my thoughts and suggesting, I warned you about this lot. Yeah? I do get that right, don't worry, warning received. With that final statement, I hung up and started to gather my things to head out to my car. Something about the situation, or maybe something Albert said about the lot, had lodged in the back of my mind like an uncomfortable feeling that wouldn't let go, filling me with suspicion all the way to his house. On the other hand, this wasn't the first time he accepted acid that he said others considered too strong. On those occasions, it had been just what I was looking for to transport me to a night of conversations with beings from other dimensions and flying among the stars with an intense trip. However, that little doubt in the back of my mind didn't let my nerves calm down when I finally got to Albert's house. My excitement for one good night, I had managed to get over the strange feeling our conversation left me. Albert and I were good friends for years. We had gone to the same high school and stayed relatively close after graduation. At school, he only sold marijuana, but he had since expanded his underground business offering various hallucinogens. Typically, he had mushrooms or acid or sometimes both. Occasionally he would get ecstasy, but that was weird, and normally I wasn't too interested. One time he had peyote, although it was only that one time, but it was a really intense experience. When I walked into his house, he was sitting at the table separating small cardboard papers. It was nothing strange. I had seen him do this hundreds of times. What I found unusual on this particular occasion was that he was wearing gloves. Albert never used gloves for this. He often microdosed Ficosec. He separated the doses, so in a sense, it was a little bonus for him. Besides the money, today, and the gloves, I asked without being able to contain my curiosity. It's like a precaution. I told you there's something weird with this sheet. I mean, just look at it. I looked at the little square of paper with a grid of perforations that made up a 10 by 10 sheet of paper with a total of 100 doses on it. I immediately knew what he was talking about. Instead of a clear liquid drizzled on a white sheet of blotting paper, it was orange. It wasn't a slight yellow hue to indicate potency or anything. It was almost a neon orange and kind of patchy. Wow, that's normal? Did you get it from a different kind or something? I didn't get it from the same kind, but I kept staring at him, waiting for him to finish his sentence. But when he never did, I tried to get the rest out of him. But can't you just stop in the middle of a sentence and leave me hanging? Bro? He seemed to snap out of his trance, improvised. gathering 3 doses, and handed them to me in the palm of my hand before I spoke. But he was acting weird when I took it from him. "Oh yeah," I said, holding my hand out for him to hand me the 3 doses. Weird in what sense? I don't really know how to describe it. It was like he had a secret, or maybe he was just a little paranoid. On second thought, his pupils seemed dilated, so maybe I was traveling when he gave it to me. Now that I think about it, that doesn't sound so strange. Well, yes, I was traveling. Sure, that he was gonna act weird. I didn't think he would take it too seriously with that. I paid him and started to walk out the door to my car. When I got to the door, I noticed that all 3 doses were still in my palm, and I had no bag or container to put them in for the way home. I stood at the door contemplating how to solve this seemingly insignificant problem. Apparently, I had been standing staring from my hand to the doorknob for much longer than I realized, because when he saw it, he yelled out to me, "Hey, are you okay, Juan? You've been trying to open this door for 5 minutes. Just turn the knob and you're out. It's not that complicated." A strange tingling sensation ran through my body twice before I could get my mouth to respond. Yes, I'm okay," I said, looking at Albert and then at the doses in my hand. I smiled to myself as I shook off the last remnants of the strange sensation and popped the 3 doses into my mouth, letting them sit under my tongue for the acid to absorb. I turned the knob and opened the door. I gave Albert a quick goodbye as I walked out and saw his expression of absolute surprise when he saw me take the 3 doses at once before even getting home. I knew that the acid usually takes about 20 minutes to kick in, and my drive home was only 10, so I would still be good for about 10 minutes, and I could get home and settle in for the wild night I was about to have. However, I started to freak out on the way back as I noticed that my breathing pattern was changing, and more waves of chills and tingles were running through my body. This must be something really potent, I thought as I parked the car and walked to my front door. Suddenly, I could no longer feel the doses under my tongue, and as I reached over to open the door, I saw them resting in the palm of my hand. "What the hell?" I said as my heart started to race. I brought my hand up to my mouth to put the doses under my tongue, but just as I moved them, they disappeared, and I could feel them again soaking in my saliva. Another shiver ran up my spine, and I started shaking myself back and forth like a dog trying to dry off. I stopped suddenly, realizing I was doing this strange dance, still standing in the threshold of my door. Come in," a strange voice whispered just behind my right ear, and I turned quickly to see who had spoken. The sight in front of me was blurry, and the street was beginning to ripple as if it were made of liquid. The passing cars became little more than blobs of color rolling a few feet before exploding into misshapen abstract vehicular shapes. I closed my eyes, rolled my eyelids, trying to rest my vision. This shouldn't have hit me as soon as something feels wrong. Something is wrong. It's wrong. Another voice whispered behind my left ear, causing me to turn again. I felt a genuine fear, thinking I had bitten off more than I could chew with this lot. My heart began to beat rapidly, and I slammed open the front door, bursting into the kitchen. I stumbled to the floor and kicked the door shut behind me. "Hey, Juan, you okay? You've been trying to get this door open for 5 minutes. Just turn the knob and walk in. It's not that complicated." "Yeah, I'm fine." My voice faded away as the kitchen reappeared before my eyes. I shook my head as I felt a new chill running down my body. "This shirt is too hot," I said as I began to take it off. "This is getting ugly fast. I need something to calm me down." My heart was beating furiously inside the prison of my ribs, and I almost started to cry in fear as I realized this was going to be much more than a bad trip. "This is going to be a bad trip," repeated a voice from my Alexa speaker on the wall. Although it sounded slowed down and much deeper than normal, I brought my hands to my chest, trying to slow my heart down, and I noticed that I still had the shirt on. "This shirt is too much," I repeated as I began to take it off. I stopped halfway when the thought that I had done this before crossed my mind. "This is going to be continued," Alexa's distorted voice from the speaker. "Shut up. How would you know?" I screamed, and as soon as the words left my mouth, the room fell into a deathly silence. A stronger shiver ran through my body, and I grabbed the counter, finally pulling myself up to a standing position. "I need something to calm me down," I thought again. "Alexa, play relaxing music," I said, hoping that would help. I needed to get some water or something to drink. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that, you little idiot. Please try again. The voice sounded strange, and I stood there stunned, trying to remember if I had actually heard that. I stumbled to the sink and decided I couldn't waste any time looking for a glass, so I turned on the faucet to drink from it. The water hit me in the face with the force of a fire hose on full pressure, and I felt like I was drowning as I fell back, falling to the ground. I turned around to ask Kevin what was going on. How would he know? Remember, I'm only 14, he said, laughing. Wait, Kevin, how are you here? You died when we were kids. I was there when you got hit by that drunk driver. Kevin just laughed, but it sounded natural and breathy. I watched him as he blinked between his normal appearance and the brutalized image I remembered after the accident. You know, you should have saved me. It wasn't my fault, me. My response was cut off by Alexa's voice from the speaker. I don't think I can help you with that. You pathetic drug addict. Be shut up. I screamed as another intense shiver ran through my body. Alexa, play relaxing music. My scream echoed through the room as a burst of death metal at maximum volume filled the space quickly. I covered my ears as the music roared and screeched. What the hell is going on? Alexa, stop, I screamed, and suddenly the room was completely silent. I decided to try and relax and headed to the couch in the living room to lay down. Maybe I could turn on the TV and watch some visuals to rear out the trip. I asked Alexa to turn on the TV as I dragged myself to the living room, but immediately a pain took over my stomach, and I vomited on the floor. I couldn't help but scream in terror, knowing that throwing up the pills could cause them to reactivate, further intensifying my already uncontrollable vision quest. Hey, Juan, are you okay? You've been trying to open the door for 5 minutes. Just turn the knob and walk in. It's not that complicated. Yes, I know, Albert. I can now. I was realizing that I was still at Albert's house. No, wait, no, or if it was my couch, that's who you are. I looked at the person in front of me, but their face was melting to the bone and then reforming, taking on my mother's disappointed expression. Just as he tried to speak, but the whole person liquefied and spilled onto the floor, and then reformed into my childhood dog, who immediately burst into flames. It's warm enough in here for you, said a booming voice bouncing between my ears. I knew somehow the voice was coming from my dead dog, who continued to burn in the heat of the room. Yeah, this shirt is too warm. I need to take it off, I replied, and the dog vanished into ash. As the last particle of ash vanished into the air, I heard 3 deep barks, the same barks I remembered from my dog. I crawled over to a tree and leaned against it, staring out at the field. Wait, there can't be a tree here. It was in the living room, right? I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Please try again. Alexa replied, although her voice sounded like someone was adjusting the speed of a record player as she spoke. Are you okay, John? I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Please try again. Are you okay, John? Okay. I need to calm down, I told myself, trying to regain some control. Maybe if I took a shower, it might calm me down. I had barely formulated the thought when another wave of chills ran through my body, and I staggered towards the bathroom. I made the mistake of looking in the mirror over the sink, and I began to scream in terror as I saw the skin on my face begin to melt, dripping into the sink, only for the vision to stop and start over with my skin still intact. I leaned back, falling into the bathtub that was already full of cold water for some reason. I'm gonna call 911, you pathetic drug addict, I heard Alexa's distorted voice say. Are you okay, Juan? Are you okay, Juan? You've been standing there trying to open the door for like 5 minutes. You just have to turn the knob and come in. It's not that complicated. Yeah, I'm okay. Wait. My voice trailed off as the cold water splashed on my face. I sank into the bathtub much deeper than should have been possible, as if it had no bottom. I screamed, but no bubbles were coming out in front of my face. Instead, colorful balloon animals were coming out of my mouth that deflate as they come out of my mouth. I tried to stand up and effortlessly got out of the bathtub. Another wave of chills flooded my body, and the world around me turned dark. I woke up in a room white that breathed and deformed around me. My head was spinning as I looked around, realizing that I was strapped to a bed of strange machines. My mind began to fill with confusion and fear. First, a huge weasel burst through the door. It transformed into a horse, and finally into a pile of human-shaped worms wearing a police uniform. Why am I here? What are they going to do to me? I asked with a shaky voice. Son, the worm policeman began to say in English, I'm not going to ask you what drugs you've taken because at this point, it doesn't matter. Do you have any idea what happened in the last 24 hours? The room took a large breath of air, expanding to almost double its original size, then shrinking again as if it was going to crush both me and the worm policeman, who had now turned into a lizard in a uniform. Nothing. I went home to have a normal night and fell asleep in the shower. So how did I end up here? I fought to control my voice and make it sound calm and normal. I knew I should have stayed away from the acid, seeing as it looked so strange. It should have worn off by now. But what if it damaged me, and it never goes away, and if I stay like this forever? I'm doomed to live on a trip perpetually, unable to function ever again. My terrifying train of thought was interrupted when the lizard officer spoke again. They found you in a public fountain, drowning. They had to taser you multiple times to get you back up and running. You were still yelling about a dead dog and telling someone named Alexa to shut up. The lizard cop paused for a moment, staring at me, apparently waiting for his words to sink into my intoxicated mind. So you want to try and tell me what happened because clearly this wasn't a normal night at home? You're okay, Juan. You've been standing there trying to open the door for like 5 minutes. You just turn the knob and walk in. It's not that complicated. I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Instead of answering, as the voices echoed in my head, I turned my face and closed my eyes. I still couldn't discern the reality of the constantly fluctuating world on this never-ending journey I can't get out of. I can't get out of this room. They won't let me. They don't trust me. But honestly, ever since I picked up those 3 little pieces of cardboard, I don't either.